Welcome to the Week 3 Steel Scorpion Sports Podcast. Live from San Diego, I'm your host, Jeff Miller, along with my co-host, live from the Bay Area, Mark Heflin, the founder of Steel Scorpion Sports. How's it going, Hef?
Doing great. I'm looking forward to talking about Week 3 today.
So before we jump into Week 3, a reminder to everyone, check us out at steelscorpionsports.com, a better species of fantasy football. You can check out the leagues pages, the podcast, check out the standings from week to week. Just learn more about mulligans, multipliers, and the all-play format. With that, Hef, let's jump right into Week 3. After 3 weeks of the NFL season, we are down to 3-0 teams. Be the Eagles, the Bengals, and the Cards. I assume those are the three you predicted before the season started?
Pretty much dead on, yeah. I was looking at the schedules and I thought, you know what? The Cardinals, they're going to beat the San Francisco 49ers, and they're going to beat the Chargers, and 3-0 looks pretty obvious. And if you had told me that Carson Palmer would be out for 2 of those 3 games and Drew Stanton would be in, I'd be even more likely to pick them at 3-0. But in all seriousness, no, these are not the exact 2 teams. The Bengals you could foresee. They're obviously a returning playoff team. They're pretty good. Although they lost both their coordinators, Zimmer and Gruden, went on to become head coaches, so there's some question marks there. But obviously, they're a quality team. Same with the Eagles, playoff team from last year. It's not a huge shock that they're 3-0. Although if you had looked at their schedule, you might have thought that Week 2 game at Indy could be a problem. And of course, it was a problem for them for most of the game, but they pulled it out in the end. And then, the Cardinals, that's kind of a surprise there. As far as how long they can go undefeated and who might be the longest, the last undefeated team, looked at the schedules a little bit. I know for a fact that neither the Bengals nor the Cardinals will lose in Week 4 because the NFL, in their infinite wisdom, decided that, hey, we should start having buys in Week 4. That makes perfect sense. Teams have played for 3 games. They need a break before they play the last 13 games. The Eagles this week actually play at the 49ers, so you have to think there's a chance they could lose there. The Niners are early favorite, around 4 or 5 points. I will actually be at the game, so I'm attending that game this weekend. Looking forward to it. The second ever wheel game, we don't count preseason, at Levi Stadium. So for next week's podcast, I'll be able to give us a review of how Levi Stadium looks. But I think there's a chance that the Eagles go down there. And then if you look forward to Week 5, if the Eagles get past that, they host the Rams in Week 5, so you have to think that's a win. And in Week 5, the Bengals play at the Patriots, and the Cardinals play at the Broncos. So odds are you would have to think that they might both lose there. And so if the Eagles do lose to the 49ers, to a desperate 49ers team this week, then it's looking like we might have no undefeated teams by the end of Week 5.
So you're telling me end of September, give or take, and we will be out of undefeated teams.
That's right. Usually it seems like we usually have a 7, 8, 9-0 team, something like that, occasionally even longer. I know in 2009, I think it was, when the Saints and the Colts met up in the Super Bowl, I think they both got to 13-0 that week, and there were some delusions of grandeur of, could we possibly have an 18-0 versus 18-0 Super Bowl? We, of course, did not, because the Colts did their patented, hey, let's forget about a historic season and just rest Peyton Manning in Week 16 and destroy the team's rhythm and, let's mess with perfection there. But if I'm reading the schedule tea leaves correctly, I think we could be out of undefeated teams by the end of Week 5.
I think you're right, and the month of October will be pretty barren from undefeated teams this year.
But if we were to look at the opposite end of the spectrum, I suppose we could look at some of the winless teams and think about how long we might go until one of those teams gets a win. And speaking of Halloween, it could be till Halloween. It could even be till November. We seem to have some really bad teams this year. You could certainly foresee the Jaguars, the Raiders, the Bucks. It could be a while before any of those teams get a win.
Yeah, I think the most likely scenario is if they play each other. And speaking of the Bucks, I don't want to toot our own horn, but on last week's podcast, I believe we mentioned we had bought into the Bucks hype, and after 2 weeks, we were willing to sell them down the river And boy, does that look like a good move now, because they looked horrid on Thursday night. Not that the Jags and the Raiders have looked like world beaters. So the race for the first pick in the 2015 draft appears to be on. And I think we have 3 early contenders.
We do have 3 early contenders, and usually at the top of the draft, you look at teams that are looking for quarterbacks. And interestingly, of those 3 teams, the Raiders have Derek Carr, who they took at the top of round 2. But maybe by the end of this year, they'll decide that he's not the answer, and maybe they do need someone else. And then the Jaguars, obviously, I feel fairly confident will not take a QB next year because they have Blake Bortles with the number 3 overall pick this year. Made his debut in week 3 when they were behind, I think, 30-0 or 30-3 at halftime to the Colts. And they had seen enough of Chad Henne to know that he is not the answer. And even though they have a shaky offensive line, they decided to throw Blake Bortles to the wolves, even though they had said all through the preseason that, 2014 is going to be a learning year. He's going to watch Chad Henne, and we'll have him in 2015. Well, how did that work out for you, Jaguars? Because by week 3, Bortles was in there.
Yeah, I'd say a 2.5 game window there is what they meant by the 2014 season.
Yes, I suppose so.
But obviously the Bucs, on the other hand, don't seem to have a true quarterback of the future. Mike Glennon, they're not invested in him. If the Bucs do continue this horrid start, they clearly could be in the market for a QB come the 2015 draft.
They very well could be, and I know of a certain QB playing in the state of Florida who is, of course, very popular and beloved by all. And by beloved by all, I mean, as of last year maybe, but no longer loved by anyone other than just FSU fans, Jameis Winston. So, but it'll be interesting to see some other QB names available. There's Winston, there's Huntley, there's Mariota, there's potentially even Petty at a Baylor. So they'll have some choices to choose from. Like you said, they don't seem to be too invested in Glennon. If they were, they wouldn't have paid decent money to bring in a 35-year-old McCown as their quarterback for this year. So we do know that Lovie Smith is safe for this year, no matter how bad they are, since he's new. But we kind of pegged this last week. If you lose at home to Derek Anderson and to Austin Davis, then when you go on the road and play a real QB like Matt Ryan, it's probably not going to be good, and it sure was not.
All right, I think that's enough on the bottom of the barrel teams. As we mentioned, they're 3 at the top, 3-0, and they're 3 at the bottom at 0-3. They look like they're in a race for the first pick. But let's talk more about, from a fantasy perspective, what happened in the past week. First, Hef, do you have a gambling recap?
I do. So the favorites in week 3 were 9-7, which is the first week of this year that the favorites have actually done better than the underdogs. As many people, including Bill Simmons at Grantland.com, have mentioned that this is the year of the underdog, which it's kind of a reaction to how last year went. And in week 1 and in week 2, the underdogs won more games than not. But week 3, the favorites finally came through. They went 9-7. And the overs went 9-7 in week 3 as well.
Yeah, and I think we might see a trend in the overs there because with all the new rules in place, the enforcement of this illegal contact, the hands to the face, more drives are going to be prolonged. All the rules seem to be favoring offense. So unless you happen to have the Seattle Seahawks playing in a game, it seems likely to me that the over is the way to go.
Yeah, I would have to concur. It depends on specific games and if there's any kind of weather conditions or great defenses that are playing. But if you're in doubt, if you think it's a coin flip, just take the over.
All right, and then from a fantasy perspective, it seemed like we had some really nice performances from a few players this week. Andrew Luck, as you already mentioned, with the Colts putting a hurting on the Jags, seemed to be the top-performing QB. Rashad Jennings actually had a great game for the New York Football Giants. And then for most people, they already know from last Thursday night's game, and we've already touched on how horrible the Bucs were. Julio Jones definitely noticed how horrible the Bucs were, especially at covering him, as he continued to run free, catch balls, and find his way into the end zone.
Yeah, Julio Jones in that game had 9 catches for 161 yards and 2 touchdowns. If that doesn't sound impressive enough as a stat line on its own, I don't even know if he played at all in the fourth quarter maybe not even almost a third quarter, because I think the Falcons were at 173-0 by the time the fourth quarter started. Just imagine the numbers he could have put up. Some of the catches that I saw him catch, there was no one within 5 feet of him. So he's already a pretty physical specimen, hard to cover as it is. But when you don't put anyone near him, I know Matt Ryan was able to find him. I think I might have been able to find him on some of those catches. So yeah, that was just a impressive performance, or maybe just a really, really bad performance from the Bucs.
Yeah, impressive by Julio, depressive by the Bucs. In addition to those great performances, there were a few surprises this week I wanted to talk about, because they do have some fantasy implications that we may want to really focus on this weekend in the future. The first was in Washington, where a certain QB, not named RG3, but Kirk Cousins, came in, led him to 34 points in the game at Philly, and actually looked pretty decent doing it. And this is the same offense that RG3 seemed not able to move down the field and hit all his reads. Cousins seemed to be able to find receivers open, and this even had an injured Djax as one of his main options. So what gives here, Hef? Am I to read into this that Kirk Cousins is greater than RG3?
Well, his stat line for the game was 30 to 48 for 427 yards and 3 touchdowns. That right there sounds like something that RG3 is probably not matched in a long time, if ever. From having seen some of the game, Kirk Cousins looks, pretty good. He looks like a legit NFL quarterback. If I were Jay Gruden, I would definitely be wondering to myself what I'm going to do here. If I was the GM of the Washington team, I'd be wondering what the plan is. There were talks in the offseason that they were maybe thinking of trading Cousins. If they had been able to get a second rounder for him, I think they might have pulled the trigger on that. They're probably very glad at this point that they did not trade him or get a second round offer for him, because they're definitely going to need him over the next 7 or 8 weeks, however long RG3 is out. But when RG3 is healthy again, they definitely have a decision on their hands. And honestly, from what I've seen, I think Cousins is a better quarterback.
Well, don't forget, though, had they traded away Cousins for a second rounder, I think Rex Grossman was still available, so I'm sure that would have worked out.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But to your point, I think Cousins definitely looked like he had a grasp of that West Coast offense, and it seemed like the whole playbook was there. Looking left, looking right, looking down the middle, not looking left and then taking off and running. So interesting to see how that progresses over the year in Washington, and definitely in the next, say, 5 or 6 weeks when RG3 is healthy. If Cousins keeps this up, does he Wally Pip RG3? That seems so unlikely to even say out loud, but I guess we have to contemplate it now after the performance from this week.
And just from a long-term perspective as well, like even if you thought that Cousins and RG3 were equal quality of quarterbacks, you still, from the Washington standpoint, may have to think you want to keep Cousins just because he's less likely to get injured. He doesn't run around as much. RG3 seems to have an injury history, and it's, complicated even further by the fact of him running around and taking more hits than Cousins does. And when you add on the fact of how good Cousins actually looks, and the fact that he's less likely to get injured, they're going to have to maybe lean towards Kirk Cousins' way. And also, he was, I believe, a third-round draft pick. So if you're looking at it, contract-wise, he's cheaper for this year and next year. So I don't know kind of what they could do with RG3 as far as, you don't want to bring him back as a backup, but I don't know kind of what kind of trade value they'd be able to get for RG3 either.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier that there'll be some interesting decisions by the coach and GM. If this doesn't work out for RG3, the GM's biggest decision will probably be what moving company to use to collect all of his stuff and move his family away from the Washington, D.C. area.
Yes.
So another surprise from the week, not nearly to the extent of Kirk Cousins, but Jeremy Maclin showed up, which was a nice surprise for Maclin owners across the league. First couple weeks, didn't look terribly impressive, was involved to an extent in the passing game, but this week, that same game, in fact, with Cousins exploding for the 400 yards on the other side of the ball, Maclin finally had a really good game.
He did. He was good. He had 8 catches, 154 yards, 1 touchdown, and kind of wonder what percentage of fantasy leagues was he started in, across the country, because I'm sure there were, some owners that stuck with him and had faith in him and maybe looked at the matchup and decided to start him, but I'm sure there were also a fair share of owners that were kind of disappointed in his week 1 or week 2 performance and decided to maybe put in someone else on their bench and give someone else a start. And they would have been disappointed. But, of course, in the Steel Scorpion Leagues, you get one mulligan to use in the whole year. And maybe this is the week that you would want to use them. You had over 20 points, and maybe if you had a disappointing starter in your lineup at either wide receiver or flex, and you looked at your options, decided to gain 10 or 15 points, maybe move 3 or 4 wins up the ladder, maybe you would pull the trigger. Another example of that is Kirk Cousins this week. You may not have started him. You may have had a bigger name quarterback that you started instead, and Kirk Cousins put up a ton of points and may have been able to pick up a few wins as well. And as far as Dolphins go, we actually had our first couple that were used this year. So last week, week 2 in the Leopard League, we had someone swap out Charles Clay for Antonio Gates. Of course, we know that Gates had 3 touchdowns last week. And so by doing that, he gained 125 points and moved up a whopping 6 wins in the standings. This season was able to top that over the course of this year. I think 6 is probably a pretty high bar, but definitely a good use of the mulligan there. And then this week in the Jaguar League, we had a team that swapped out Matt Asiata for Deshaun Jackson, and they gained 11-something points and gained 3 wins. So I think that's probably kind of more in line with the typical mulligan use that we'll see, probably somewhere in the 3 to 4 range as far as wins that you pick up. But the week 2 use of 6 wins was quite impressive.
Yeah, and I think that goes to your point. When you have somebody on the bench like Antonio Gates that week, scores you 3 touchdowns, grabs a good number of, I think, 9 balls, and goes over 100 yards, especially at a position like tight end. Odds are whomever you started over him, your other tight end did not perform that well. But there was another guy this week in that same game you just mentioned with Cousins and Macklin that also performed well and may definitely have been in line to be a mulligan, and that was Jordan Matthews.
Yeah, he had quite a game. He had 2 touchdowns. He hadn't done a whole lot in week 1 and week 2, and it'll be interesting to see going forward if this was kind of a breakout game for him. He was a great receiver in college. A lot of SEC and Vanderbilt receiving records. I think he's the all-time leading receiver in SEC history, so certainly quite accomplished in college. He's a round 2 draft pick and going to a high-octane offense with the Eagles. Now, I don't think we're going to see that kind of performance week in and week out, of course, but it will be interesting to see if he kind of slides back more into his, week 1 or week 2 role, or maybe he gets, 2 or 3 catches for 40 yards, or if he's really going to kind of step up and be one of their top receivers this year. It'll be interesting to track.
Yeah, and even if he doesn't step up every week, weeks like this at least make him a potential mulligan use. And again, for everyone that might not be familiar with the mulligan, you should check out steelscorpionsports.com. Check out the website. On the rules page, you can read all about the all-play format, mulligans, and multipliers. Last half, I think we've talked about most of the upside surprises. There were a couple players that didn't do a great job week to week. LaShawn McCoy, again, back to that same game. For some reason, I keep going back to the Washington-Philly game. LaShawn McCoy really had his worst outing of the season, maybe of the last 2 seasons.
Yeah, he did not have a good game. He only, I forget his stat line, maybe 15 or 20 yards. He did not look good. I know at one point he had 10 carries for 10 yards. Certainly not the kind of stat line that you would expect from McCoy. Washington was definitely bottling him up, and I think he finished the day with maybe 2 or 3 fantasy points, something like that. So very disappointing. Obviously, he was. If you had him on your roster, you started him. There's no reason that you would have set him. Another one that comes to mind is Danny Woodhead. He was probably started in most leagues. I think he finished with 0.1 points, I believe. I know it was a very, very small number. If you had him, you probably started him, especially with Ryan Matthews being out. Figured he would get some more work, and so he got injured, broke his leg. He's out for the season, is the word that's saying. So you definitely did not get much production from him this week, and you won't get any production from him the rest of this year.
Yeah, no, I think it's a little unfair to categorize he and McCoy in the same breath, as McCoy played nearly the entire game. He did have to sit out for one brief spell in the first half, whereas Woodhead will not play the rest of the year and did not play much in that game. But you're right. Both of them probably were in the starting lineup. Another player who probably was in the starting lineup and probably disappointed all of his fantasy owners, me included, was Antonio Gates. You've mentioned the mulligan from last week, as Gates was having the best game of the season, and all Gates owners know that was going to be his best game of the year. But you hope he follows it up with at least a 5 or 6 catch performance, gets you 60, 70 yards, maybe gets a score. What you don't hope he does is follow it up with maybe a 1 catch performance, 3-5 yard performance, something like that.
Well, you're selling him way, way short. He actually ended up with 80 total yards on that 1 catch. So let's give him proper due. But I think the funny thing is, to me, is in week 2, when he had a surprise performance out of nowhere, he was probably started in, I don't know, maybe 10 to 15, maybe 20% of leagues, fantasy leagues across the country. And then in week 3, all his owners were like, hey, oh my goodness, 100 yards and 3 touchdowns. We got to get this guy in my starting lineup. So in week 3, he was probably started in, 80+% of leagues across the country, and then got the 1 catch for 8 yards. So, great performance when he was on people's bench, and then a horrible performance when he was in people's starting lineups.
Well, I'll have you know he was in my starting lineup both weeks. So thank you, Antonio, and no thank you, Antonio. The last bit you already touched on here briefly with Danny Woodhead, but I did want to mention a couple other injuries that have happened in week 3. We mentioned this on last week's podcast. Injuries across the board are really hammering fantasy players already this year. But this week, you mentioned Woodhead. We also saw Dennis Pitta. Probably not as impactful. He may have been a situational tight end for many people. The unfortunate thing for him is it's another hip injury. And for Dennis Pitta, this may be it. If you saw the play live, as I did, he's not contacted. It's a turning, twisting his body injury. That just screams to an unstable hip. And when you get multiple hip injuries in multiple years, I don't like his chances of coming back and being an effective player.
Yeah, he could be done. And in that situation as well, from a fantasy standpoint, I don't know if there's anyone that really kind of jumps up and takes his place that you want to get. I mean, Owen Daniels is there, the former Houston Texans tight end, but he's not a real, I would not consider him a tight end one. You probably have better options out there. He should get more targets now that Pitt is not in the picture, but not someone that I would rush out to get if he's available as a free agent in your league.
No, maybe this will help Torrey Smith get towards his 100 catches, and I believe he's up to 6.
Yeah, he should get some more targets going forward. And speaking of Smith and the Ravens, it does randomly remind me that the Carolina Panthers play at Baltimore Ravens this week. And as we all know, Steve Smith spent the majority, or until this year, all of his career as a Carolina Panther. They decided to part ways with him at the end of last season. He is 35 after all. And he signed on with the Ravens, and I forget his exact quote, but he had a funny quote that when he was going to play the Panthers, there was going to be blood all over the field or something like that. So
please refer to him as Steve Smith Sr.
Yes, definitely one of the more interesting name changes from Steve Smith to Steve Smith Sr. because he had a son named Steve Smith Jr. So naturally, he now has a jersey that says Smith Sr. in case we had any confusion as to who he was. So it will be interesting to see what kind of game he has against the Panthers this week.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I was a little confused. I'm happy about that name change. One more injury to note for Eddie Lacy owners. I think he must be hurt because those numbers look pretty pedestrian. Hef, I know you're an owner, so I assume some sort of leg injury, maybe a chest injury, something. Am I missing it?
I think, if I read the injury report correctly, I think he pulled an eyelash during one of his carries, and so he had to sit out for a while. We joke because we care, of course, but as an Eddie Lacy owner, it's been a frustrating experience. Now, he has played some good rushing defenses. He played the Seahawks, of course, on a great defense. He played the Jets, who have a bad secondary, but a good front seven, so they slowed him down. And then all the experts were expecting a high-scoring game this week between the Packers and the Lions. I saw, many score predictions like 41-38, 47-40, and all these ridiculous scores. And the final score, I think, was 19-7. So the experts were quite wrong on that. But yeah, Eddie Lacy did not have a good game. As an Eddie Lacy owner, I certainly hopes he turns it around, but we'll see. The first 2 weeks doesn't look good. As someone who took Trent Richardson as a first-round running back last year and Eddie Lacy as a first-round running back next year, I think I'm going to have to start scouting wide receivers for next year. Maybe take Megatron, maybe take Julio Jones, maybe A.J. Green, maybe Des Bryant. We'll see. As of now, I'm moving towards the first-round wide receiver in my 2015 fantasy drafts.
Don't forget kickers and defense. They're always available in the first round, and you could clearly have the best. Also,
and the best thing, I said this before, the best thing about taking a team defense in round one, it's not going to get injured. The whole defense, you may lose some defenders, but you're not going to have to cut the defense because the whole defense gets injured. So
that's right.
That is the one upside.
And really, remember, half the battle is being available. So good for you, starting to think differently. But maybe on the running back topic, it's you shouldn't take the rookie performer after his 1 year of wonderment. We saw this last year. We saw the Doug Martin owners and we saw the Trent Richardson owners, like you, who fell into that trap, took a guy after one good season as the workhorse, and the second year couldn't replicate that. Whereas other running backs, like Giovanni Bernard, weren't the workhorse in year one, but looked to be the better back, and then were given a better chance this year and looks to be the better back on his team and looks to be the real deal. So Eddie Lacy this year falls into that Trent Richardson category where he had one good season as a workhorse. Now this year, 3 games, mind you, not a large sample size, but doesn't look great.
Yeah, that is a good point. That is something that I will keep in mind for next year. If for example, Carlos Hyde were to blow up in the second half of the season and have a great rookie year, I would definitely have to think twice about taking him in first round of next year's draft, even if all the rankings are putting him in the 6 to 10 range or something like that. I would have to think twice. Maybe I just have to avoid Alabama running backs in the first round because I had T-Rich and then Eddie Lacy. P.J. Yeldon is probably going to be a rookie next year. He won't go until later in the draft, but I may have to avoid him as well. I may just stay away from Alabama running backs, period.
But wait, I mean, if you look at their track record the last few years, it's been very consistent. Eddie Lacy, Trent Richardson, Mark Ingram, these guys are all producing well below expectations, so I'd say they're very consistent.
Well, listen, in another way, they haven't been inconsistent because T-Rich and Lacy both had really good rookie years, followed up by not-so-good sophomore years, whereas Mark Ingram has just never really done much of anything. Like, he hasn't, everyone always expects that, next year will be, this is the year that Mark Ingram breaks out. This is the year. And he actually, looked decent so far this year, but then he, broke his hand. So I will probably never own Mark Ingram again going forward. And I can almost definitely say I will never own T-Rich because if you have T-Rich on your team and watch him play and you're watching him get 3 yards per carry, it's not very exciting. And Eddie Lacy, maybe. We'll see. Jury's out, but not likely.
All right, well, I think we've touched on the key injuries there. Again, for you Woodhead and Pitt owners, feel bad for you. For you Lacy owners, feel bad for you for different reasons. Let's switch our attention here to something that's a little non-fantasy related per se. Obviously, there are some implications to it. But if you look at the AFC, Mark, it almost feels like you could pencil in the 6 playoff teams for this upcoming playoffs, still 13 games away, from a pool of probably 7 teams. And this seems pretty early to be able to say that, oh, by the way, all of you who aren't listed here in my 17 pool, yeah, you're playing for draft picks.
In fact, yeah, this is the earliest that I can remember being able to narrow down the playoff pool so soon in week 3. In fact, I'm willing to go ahead and say of the 7 teams that I'm about to name, the playoff pool of 6 will almost definitely come from this pool of 7, with a maybe 15% chance that at most one AFC playoff team comes from outside of this group. So those teams are, in no particular order, the Broncos, the Chargers, the Colts, the Bengals, the Ravens, the Steelers, and the Patriots. Now, you'll maybe have noticed I have written off the Texans, even though they're 2-1, and I've written off Buffalo, even though they're 2-1. I just don't see it. I think it's kind of an early season mirage. I don't see them finishing in the playoffs. Miami looked good in week 1. They beat New England. Maybe thinking this is their year. They looked bad the last 2 weeks. I don't see them in the playoffs. And then the one other thing you might notice from the 7 teams I mentioned, I only mentioned one AFC South team. Like I said, I don't think Texans are real. NC is 1-2. They play at Indy this week. Assuming Indy wins that, then the Titans are 1-3. They're kind of out of it. The Jaguars, I don't even need to mention. And so yeah, I think that. And then the Patriots are the one AFC East team that I mentioned. Of course, they've won that division for 83 years running, so it won't be any surprise when they win the AFC East. Like I said, I can't see any playoff teams coming from outside that group of 7. So one of those 7 teams will get left out, but I think that's how it's shaken out.
I'd love to say I could argue with you and really come up with a compelling case for someone else, but I tend to have to agree with you, unfortunately. Although I would say if there is one team that you left out that I think might have a shot, it's probably the Texans. The defense is for real. J.J. Watt, really, he's a game changer. The offense isn't dynamic with a man named Ryan Fitzpatrick running it, but with a quarterback guru as their coach, maybe he can get enough out of Fitzpatrick to get them to 9 or 10 wins and get a break here or there to make that last wild card?
Yeah, I would say you're right on the Texans. If there is one team outside of that group that has a chance, their main case is the fact that they have a last place schedule, they have a decent defense, and of course, they're in probably one of the weaker divisions in the NFL. They're going to need to play the Titans twice, and they're going to need to play the Jags twice. And if there is one team that's probably the most suspect out of that group of 7, it's probably the Steelers. I think they're going to have to win some shootouts. They had 3 defenders get injured last night to the point that they're now bringing back James Harrison. It was already said he was retiring, so their defense is hurting. They're losing some starters, but the offense was good. With Roethlisberger, Antonio Brown looks really good against a good Carolina defense last night. Le'Veon Bell and Blunt both ran for 100 yards last night, but if the Steelers defense is not the Steelers defense that we're used to, and they have to play some shootouts, then yeah, they could get in a situation where they're having to deal with the Texans in a tiebreaker situation for a wild card.
Yeah, anytime you have to bring a retired linebacker out of retirement to shore up your defense, not a good sign.
Agreed.
All right, well, I think that's enough for this week's podcast, all the open items from week 3. I want to thank my co-host Mark Heflin for staying up late in the Bay Area. Again, please check out the website, steelscorpionsports.com. Go to the rules tab, look at our leagues pages, go to the blog, learn more about mulligans, multipliers, and the all-play format. Tell your friends. Keep tuning into the podcast weekly. We hope to keep entertaining, give you some tidbits around fantasy, some other gambling-related items. But again, check us out, steelscorpionsports.com. It's a better species of fantasy football. Signing off from San Diego, I'm Jeff Miller.
Signing off from Bay Area, I'm Mark Heflin, and we look forward to next week's podcast as well.
All right, everybody. We'll talk to you in week 4.